There are decades where nothing happens, and there are weeks where decades happen. Vladimir Lenin. The end may justify the means, as long as there is something that justifies the end. Leon Trotsky in The Class Foundations of Moral Practice. Dealing as we are with the very first experiment in proletarian dictatorship in world history, and one taking place at that under the hardest conceivable conditions, caught in the coils of the most reactionary military power in Europe, and accompanied by the completest failure on the part of the international working class, it would be a crazy idea to think that every last thing done or left undone represented the very pinnacle of perfection. Rosa Luxemburg on the Russian Revolution. Alexander II, the great reforming Tsar of the 19th century, was assassinated on the 13th of March 1881. During his reign as Emperor of Russia, he tried to pull the country into the European family of nations by abolishing serfdom in 1861, an institution whereby the gentry owned their peasants, who were tied to the land in effective slavery. The group who carried out the killing called themselves the People's Will, and represented a substratum of Russian populism. They saw the peasant village commune as a model for a future socialist society, and were committed to using terrorism to eradicate the old order. Alexander II's son and successor, Alexander III, instituted a regime of reactionary repression in response to the untimely demise of his father. His rule saw the introduction of a stricter censorship, which drove political radicals underground, out of the public sphere. Whereas beforehand, the populists had sought social change through education of the masses, new political groups now emerged that were dedicated to annihilating the ruling classes. When Alexander III's son came to power in 1894, it was clear that he was going to follow in the footsteps of his father and not attempt such dangerous upheavals as his grandfather had brought to pass. Only in 1905, in the face of a general uprising across the empire in the villages and factories, did the Tsar institute limited reform and seek to place constitutional limits on his rule, when he introduced a parliament known as the Duma, elected by a tiny franchise. More than anywhere in Europe, apart from perhaps Germany, the dominant form of organized socialism in Russia was Marxism. Russian Marxists had a problem, however. Unlike in Germany, Russia's industrial development was lackluster. About 80% of the population were peasants, and industry was mostly based in the city of St. Petersburg. Marx said that the proletariat, or urban working class, would be the makers of the revolution, their strength in numbers allowing them to throw off the yoke of the bourgeoisie. Without a majority proletariat to mobilize, the Russian Marxists had to be creative with their strategy. Some saw the need for a bourgeois revolution to precede the proletarian and institute a fully developed capitalism before socialism could arrive. Others wanted a workers' and peasants' dictatorship to oversee the transition and prevent the capitalist exploitation this would inevitably entail. The split resulted in Menshevik and Bolshevik factions, respectively. Bolshevik meaning majority and Menshevik minority, although the balance was quite slight. The Russian Social Democratic Labour Party was formed at the end of the 19th century with the goal of bringing socialism to Russia. They all believed that Marxism held the key to understanding history, but they disagreed about how to change its course. The party's leading lights were professional revolutionaries, preparing the ground for insurrection. Russian Marxists were pursued by the Tsarist authorities through the secret police, known as the Okhrana, and many, including Lenin, were sent into internal exile in Siberia. This treatment was not comparable to the brutal labour camps known as gulags, which emerged under Stalin. Only the revolutionaries' travel and communication was limited. Once they had served their time, many of them left Russia for self-imposed exile in Europe's liberal capitals. A top choice was London, where the British authorities left them undisturbed and they were free to write their incendiary newspaper Iskra, which means the spark. This was then smuggled into Russia. Among them was Lenin, who argued in What is to be Done that trade union activity alone would not bring about socialism. The workers should also be educated in Marxism, and there should be a vanguard party of full-time dedicated revolutionaries to promote such ideas. Lenin failed to predict the outbreak of the First World War, but quickly theorized in retrospect that it was the inevitable outcome of imperialist capitalism. Most labor movements across Europe succumbed to supporting the various national war efforts instead of promoting international class solidarity, including, to Lenin's disappointment, Germany's SPD. Lenin's Bolsheviks were unusual in their advocacy of revolutionary defeatism, the theory that Russia losing the war would precipitate the collapse of the Tsarist regime. On the 23rd of February 1917, in Russia's Julian calendar, our 8th of March and International Women's Day, there was a massive general strike across the country. The police refused to quell the uprising, and Nicholas II was forced to resign his command of the army. It soon also became clear that the soldiers would refuse to fight unless the Tsar was removed. He therefore abdicated a week later in favour of his brother, who refused the title, and thus ended over 300 years of Romanov rule in Russia. A provisional government was instituted that shared power with the now called Petrograd Soviet. Petersburg was renamed Petrograd because it sounded more Russian during the war. These two bodies wrestled for legitimacy, and ultimately the Provisional Government lost that battle when the Bolsheviks seized power in October of the same year. The Bolsheviks called for an immediate peace, which they concluded with Germany in March 1918, in a treaty known as Brest-Litovsk. They were now using the Gregorian calendar, which we share. Soon after the seizure of power, Russia entered into a civil war where the newly formed Red Army faced enemies dubbed in propaganda as the Whites, which was really a general term for a series of disparate groups of monarchists, nationalists, liberals, and non-Bolshevik socialists. Near the end of the conflict, after the Reds defied the odds and defended the revolution, the Bolsheviks sought to export their socialism to Poland on the point of a bayonet. This failed, and they were driven out of the country. With the economy in ruins, Lenin controversially allowed small-scale capitalism to resume in Russia and encouraged foreign investment. And this was known as the New Economic Policy. In 1922, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics was declared, in which Russia, nominally, was one among equals, the various other Soviet socialist republics having the right to self-determination and cultural autonomy.